Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sukkah. We are up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Zayin. Today's Mishnayot should be Leilum Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbayev, and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam beGan Eden, Amen. This Mishnah speaks of a house, not a Sukkah, whose roof is made of beams that are between 3 and 4 tefachim wide. As taught in the previous Mishnah, Rabbi Meir rules that such boards are rabbinically invalid for use as schach because they resemble the roof beams of a house, but Rabbi Yehuda holds that they are valid. Nevertheless, all would agree that this house is disqualified for 2 reasons. First, the roof of every house is biblically unfit for schach because its beams were put in place as roofing to provide a roof for regular year-round residents and not as schach to provide shade. And even if the owner were to say that he now wants to use his roof as schach, it would remain biblically invalid because schach must be valid from the moment it is constructed. It cannot be fixed later by a mere statement. This is another application of the rule, ta'aseh v'lo mina asur. You shall make a sukkah and not just fix that which was already made. Second, the rabbinic decree against wide beams applies here even according to Rabbi Yehuda, because they belong to an actual roof of a house. Now, the rabbis decreed against using wide beams or boards as schach because they resembled the beams of a roof. Therefore, if they would be permitted, a person might think that just as he can fulfill the mitzvah by sitting under wide beams in a sukkah, so can he fulfill the mitzvah by sitting under the beams of his house. Therefore, although Rabbi Yehuda generally holds that the decree does not apply to beams narrower than 4 tefachim, he would agree that it does apply to beams that have already been built into a roof because they do not only resemble roof beams, but they are actual roof beams. The Mishnah discusses how such a roof can be converted into valid schach. Tikra she'en aleh ma'aziva. In the case of a roof consisting of boards between 3 and 4 tefachim wide that has no plaster on it, usually the Rav explains the beams of roof are covered with a layer of plaster. Our Mishnah, though, speaks of roof that had not yet been plastered, for if it did contain plaster, none of the procedures that the Mishnah is going to mention could convert it into valid schach. Since plaster does not grow from the ground, it cannot be used as schach under any circumstances. So here we're referring to the case of a roof that has no plaster on it. Rabbi Yehuda says that Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel disagree about how to convert it into valid schach. Bet Shammai say mifakpek. Even if he shifts the boards, he takes out the nails and moves the board slightly, that does not help. V'notel hadmi bentayim. Rather, he must take out every other board and fill the spaces with valid schach. By shifting the boards, he solves the biblical problem of the beams having been put down as roofing and not schach, because he constructs the roof anew, this time for the purpose of schach. However, he does not avoid the rabbinic prohibition against using boards that resemble roof beams, for since these boards had once been roof beams, they continue to resemble roof beams. His only option, therefore, is to replace every other board with valid schach, which solves both problems. Now, this procedure solves the biblical problem of the beams having been put in place as roofing and not as schach, because every other beam is replaced with schach material that is being put down in the first place for the purpose of schach. And this procedure also removes the concern that since the beams resemble those in a roof, people might think that they can fulfill the mitzvah by sitting under the roof of the house, because when everyone sees this person going to the trouble of removing and replacing every other beam, they will realize that a regular roof is invalid. Now, it is unnecessary to shift any of the remaining boards according to Bet Shammai. Bet Hillel omrim, but Bet Hillel say, mifakpek o notel achad bim bentayim. He may either shift all the boards or take out every other board and fill the spaces with valid schach. Even the procedure of shifting the boards according to Bet Hillel suffices for both problems. It solves the biblical problem of the beams having been put down as roofing and not schach, because shifting the boards is equivalent to putting them down a second time. Now, Bet Hillel hold that it also solves the rabbinic problem of the beams resembling the beams of a roof. Since these beams are between 3 and 4 tefachim wide, they should be valid according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Tana of this part of our Mishnah, who permitted such beams in the previous Mishnah. They are forbidden only because they are part of an actual roof. Therefore, once the owner shifts them, showing that he does not consider them part of his roof, they are permitted. Now, Rabbi Yehuda's explanation of Bet Hillel, who the halacha usually follows, accords with his ruling in the previous Mishnah, where he said that beams narrower than 4 tefachim are valid for schach. As the Rav says, V'alachak Rabbi Yehuda shamar mishum Bet Hillel. The halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who explains his version of Bet Hillel. Now, in contrast to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir holds that there was no dispute between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel in this case. Rabbi Meir says that according to both Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, notel ahad mi bintayim then mefakpek. He must remove every other board and fill the spaces with valid schach and not shift the boards. Meaning, the only way to solve both problems is to remove and replace every other board. Nothing is gained by shifting them. Like Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir also follows his opinion in the previous Mishnah, where he prohibited even boards that are only 3 tvachim wide. So according to his view, shifting all the boards of this house, which are wider than 3 tvachim, does not remove the prohibition, because the boards are always invalid on account of their size, regardless of whether they were once part of roof. So in summary, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is a dispute about how to adjust the beams of roof that are between 3 and 4 tvachim wide. Bet Shammai ruled that the only way to make them valid is to remove every other board and fill the spaces with valid schach, while Bet Hillel say that one may use either this method or the method of shifting all the boards. And B, according to Rabbi Meir, everyone agrees that the only effective procedure is to remove every other board and fill the spaces with valid schach. And like we said again, V'alachak Rabbi Yehuda shamar mishum Bet Hillel. The Rav says the halacha follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and his explanation of Bet Hillel. And that is in a Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chet now discusses another instance where gaps between strips of invalid schach are filled with valid schach. Hamkares sukato b'shapudin o ba'aruchot hamita. In the case of one who makes a roof over his sukkah with metal spits or with the sideboards of a bed, both of which are unfit for schach, and he leaves spaces between them that he fills with valid schach. Now, just to explain, metal spits are invalid schach because metal does not grow from the ground. And furthermore, Rashi says on page 17a, in Masechet Sukkah, metal spits are utensils that can become tameh. And in the explanation of the side boards of a bed, the Mishnah refers to the long boards that form the sides of a rectangular bed frame. If the board is still attached to its 2 legs, it is classified as a utensil which is capable of becoming tameh. So the Mishnah says, if one makes a roof over his sukkah with metal spits or with the sideboards of a bed, and he leaves spaces between them that he fills with valid schach, the law is as follows. Im yesh revach benen kimutan kshera. If the area of all the space between them, which is filled with valid schach, is about the same size as the spits and frames themselves, the sukkah is valid. Meaning, if the total area of the valid schach is slightly larger than the total area of the invalid schach, the sukkah is valid, since most of it is covered by valid schach. But the Rav says, if the total area filled by the valid schach would be equal to the total area of the invalid items, the sukkah would be disqualified. Now, we learned earlier that if there are gaps in schach, it is disqualified unless the total area of the solid material is larger than the total area of the gaps. Similarly, in our Mishnah's case, the Rav explains, where the roof of a sukkah contains both valid and invalid materials, the total area of the valid parts must exceed the total area of the invalid parts. Now, another law about schach, hachotet begadish la'asod b'sukkah, if one hollows out a pile of hay to make a sukkah inside it, meaning he removes some hay from inside the haystack, thereby creating a space in which he can dwell, and he leaves the top of the haystack in place to serve as schach, and nas sukkah, it is not a valid sukkah, meaning because schach must be valid at the very moment it is built or put in place. If it was invalid at that time, it cannot be fixed later. In this case, the top of the haystack was not considered schach when it was originally put in place, because schach is defined as something that makes roof over an empty space, whereas the top of a haystack covers solid material. Therefore, even if one later makes an empty space in the haystack for which the top provides shade, it remains invalid. And it's brought down in diagram A in note 4 in the Art School Elucidated. And that is in Rabotai today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.